On an October morning, when the light was still too thin to show a face, and the rain was tapping against the glass roof of Union Station, August Rourke stood beneath the arch of the Great Hall, with a bunch of purple asters wilting slowly in his hand, and he was about to meet a woman who was not the one he believed he was waiting for. He had cut those flowers himself while it was still dark outside, in the rooftop greenhouse where his mother had planted them, and where she had been laid to rest 11 years before. In all those 11 years, no one had been permitted to cut a single stem, and yet this morning he cut 7. His 4 men stood scattered behind him, 10 paces back and no closer, because in this city people understood exactly how much distance a man named Rourke was owed. The train pulled in, letting out one long breath, and he watched each window slide past the way a man watches the sky before a storm. The woman he was waiting for did step down. She saw him standing there with the flowers and the 4 shadows behind him, and then she could not take another step. She backed away and sank onto a stool at the all-night coffee counter in the station hall, her hands shaking too badly to hold a cup. The only person who sat down across from her that morning was a woman wiping down the counter, in a worn canvas coat, an apron still marked with a coffee stain she hadn't had time to take off, her rubber-soled shoes worn down hard along the outer edge in the way that only 10 years of standing in one place can wear them. She sat down without waiting to be asked. Sometime later, it was she who crossed the hall with an envelope in her hand. August stepped forward. Flowers first, Hope doing most of the thinking for him. "Miss Ashford?" She raised a hand to stop him before he could come any closer. Not the gesture of a frightened woman, but the gesture of someone who had stopped 1,000 drunks across 1,000 long night shifts and had never once had to raise her voice. "You're looking for the wrong person." 5 words, enough to break a bunch of flowers. The whole hall seemed to miss a breath. The 4 shadows behind him shifted their stance all at once, very slightly, and she did not step back an inch. Then came the thing no one in that station had seen coming. He did not get angry. August Rourke looked down at the flowers in his hand, looked up at the rain soaking through both her shoulders, and then he lowered the flowers, took off his black wool coat, and laid it over the shoulders of the woman who had just turned him away. "Then I'm glad to meet whoever you are," he said. "You walked through the rain all this way to tell a stranger bad news to his face. That's no small thing." She turned to go, then stopped, and said one more thing, quietly, the way a person hands back change. "The second man on your left just lied to you. It wasn't about anything much, but he lies with a very practiced hand." In the records of this city, August Rourke was not a kind man. His name was spoken with the same caution people reserve for bad weather. So the question was never why he didn't get angry. The question was what he saw. He had 31 days before he lost everything his father had left him, and the one condition holding it together had just turned and walked back up the platform. That was what he knew. What he did not know was far larger. 3 years earlier, on a night when the snow fell so heavily the city's streetlights went dark, someone had saved his life and walked away before he could see her face, and this morning, beneath the glass roof of Union Station, he was standing one step away from her without the faintest idea. If this story keeps you to the very last line, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you can sit with us a while longer. The car did not pull away from the curb outside the station for a long while, and none of the 4 men inside it said a word, because their employer had not yet spoken, and in that particular silence, speaking first had never once worked out well for anybody. August Rourke sat with the envelope resting flat on his knee, still sealed, and he turned it over twice without opening it. Then he asked the man beside the driver a small question about where the car had been parked while he was inside, and the answer came back easy and smooth and slightly wrong, and the man had no way of knowing that a woman in a coffee-stained apron had already handed his employer the shape of that lie the way a person hands back change. August did not raise his voice. He did not ask a second question. He simply turned his head and looked at the man for the length of one long breath, and the look was not angry, and it was not cold. It was something more patient and more terrible than either, the look of a man reading a page he had already decided he would come back to. Then he faced forward again and told the driver to go, and behind him, 3 men who had said nothing at all understood with perfect clarity that whatever else happened in the coming month, they would never again tell this man a lie about anything. Not about a parking space, not about a delivery, not about the weather. That was all it took. In the world August Rourke had grown up in, most men believed power was a thing you demonstrated. He had learned young, from a father who taught him more by silence than by instruction, that power demonstrated is power spent, and power withheld is power that keeps earning. He watched the wet gray city slide past the window, the wipers moving in their steady, tired rhythm, and he thought about a woman who had noticed in 40 seconds something he had missed in 4 years. When they crossed the river, he finally spoke again, and his voice was so low the driver had to lean slightly toward it. "Find out who she is," he said. "The woman who was wiping the counter. Not the one who came off the train," he added, because he saw the confusion begin to form and had no patience for it. "The other one, the one who sat down." Someone asked, carefully, what he wanted done once they found her. "Nothing," August said. "I want to know her name." And that was the only order he gave that morning, and the envelope stayed sealed in his coat pocket all the way home, because he found, to his own considerable surprise, that he was in no particular hurry to read what a woman he had never met had written about a life she had decided not to live. Across the river, in a neighborhood where the buildings leaned close enough together to keep the wind out of the alleys, Maren Sloan walked the last 6 blocks home with her collar turned up and a borrowed black wool coat folded over her arm, because she had not been able to think of any polite way to give it back to a man surrounded by 4 other men, and because it was too fine a thing to leave on a stool in a train station. She climbed the 3 flights slowly, the way a person climbs when their feet have already carried them through a full night, and she turned her key without making a sound, because the sound of that lock was the one sound in the world she had trained herself to soften. The lamp in the corner was still burning, throwing a low, warm circle across the front room. Milo was asleep on the sofa where he always fell asleep waiting, 6 years old and starfished on his back with the blanket pulled up neat to his chin the way Dot had tucked it. 1 sock on and 1 sock off, a book open and face down on his chest, rising and falling with him. Maren stood in the doorway with her coat still on, and looked at him for longer than she needed to. Then she lifted the book, marked the page with the ribbon, set it on the table, and eased her hands under him, and he made the small, complaining noise of a boy who has been carried to bed every night of his life and has decided to protest it on principle, and he was asleep again before she reached the hallway. On the far corner of the kitchen table, where the light did not quite reach, and where she had put them so that the light would not quite reach, sat a stack of folded papers and an envelope from a man named Fitz Barlow, the 3rd one that month, addressed in the same careful hand each time. She stood over it for a moment with her thumb on the edge. Then she turned it face down, the way you turn a photograph you are not ready to look at, and she switched off the lamp, and she went to bed with the sky beginning to gray behind the curtain and the borrowed coat still hanging by the door, black wool against a wall of chipped paint, looking exactly as out of place as it was. The library at the gray stone house on the north side smelled of cold ash and old paper, and Emmett Vance, who had been the family's attorney for 26 years and looked every one of them, laid the will on the long table and put on his glasses and did not sit down, because a man reads bad news better standing. August stood at the window with his back to the room, and the rain still coming down on the greenhouse glass 3 floors above them, and he told the lawyer to read it again, all of it, out loud, the way you ask a doctor to repeat a diagnosis you heard perfectly well the first time. Ambrose Rourke had written it in plain language, which was the cruelest thing about it, because plain language leaves a man nowhere to stand. The whole of it, the port, the 3 hotels, the trucking interests, the trust, would pass to his son entire and unbroken, on the condition that his son be a married man keeping 1 household, and that the marriage be confirmed by the Council of 5 Families before his 35th birthday. Failing that condition, half of everything went to his nephew Desmond Rourke, who had never in his life carried a crate off a dock or stood in a cold warehouse at 4 a.m. counting anything, and who had spent the last half year in unhurried conversation with a development group out of state that had plans for the South Haven waterfront involving 400 households and a great deal of demolition. August had read the will in the summer, the week his father was buried, and he had made the same calculation any man in his position would make, and Vance had watched him make it, and had waited, and now Vance explained, again, why the calculation did not work, because it was not a court that would rule on this. Courts could be argued with. Courts had rules a good attorney could stand inside of. This went to the council, and the council had written its own conditions into the confirmation a generation ago, and they had done it precisely because men like Ambrose Rourke were known for trying to control their sons after death, and men like August Rourke were known for trying to get around it. There were 3 locks. The first was that the marriage had to be vouched for by the people who worked inside the house, the driver, the housekeeper, the cook, under their own names, in their own words, and a man could not buy that, because lying to the council was not a favor you did for your employer. It was a sentence you handed yourself, and everyone in that city old enough to shave understood the difference. The second was one roof. Not a signature, not a certificate, not a photograph in a newspaper, but two people living inside the same walls for the full term, seen doing it, by people who would be asked. The third was the one Vance saved for last, and he took his glasses off before he said it, which was how August knew. Any member of the family could petition for review. Any one of them, at any point, could ask the council to look hard at whether the thing was real, and Desmond had begun assembling that petition 6 months ago, before Ambrose was even in the ground, which meant Desmond had read the will while the old man was still breathing, which meant somebody had shown it to him. August turned around then for the first time. He asked how long. Vance said he did not know, and that he had wondered about it for a while now, and that wondering was not the same as knowing, and that he had learned in 26 years not to say a name out loud until he could put paper under it. There was a long silence in that room, and the rain kept on, and August Rourke looked at the table where his father had signed the thing and understood, finally and completely, what had been done to him. "My father knew exactly what I am," he said. "He knew there was nothing in this city I could not put a price on if I decided to. So he built the one thing I could not buy, and he put everything I have behind it. And then he sat back to see whether I could manage it. He picked up the will, looked at the signature a moment longer, and set it down again. 31 days, he said. And the woman who was supposed to solve it just got back on a train. The message came to the diner 2 days later, not by telephone and not by any of the 4 men from the station, but on a plain card handed across the counter by a driver who waited while she read it, which was itself a kind of message. It gave an address on the South Haven waterfront, and no explanation. And at the bottom, in a hand she did not recognize, someone had written her name correctly. Both parts of it. Spelled right, which meant that whoever had gone looking properly. Maren Sloane arrived early, because she had arrived early to every job she had ever held, and because arriving early was the only advantage a person in her position ever got for free, and the woman at the front desk of the port office told her to wait in the corridor outside, on a bench that faced a long wall of frosted glass, with one clear panel set into it at eye height, the way older buildings sometimes have, a window cut for a foreman to watch a floor. Through it she could see into the room beyond, and she could not hear a word of what was happening in there, and that turned out to be the worst part. August Rourke sat on the near edge of the desk rather than behind it, in his shirt sleeves, his coat over the back of the chair, and across from him stood a heavy-set man in his 50s, with his cap in both hands, turning it slowly, the way a man turns something when his hands need a job. There were 2 other men in the room, and neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke, and the whole scene had the terrible stillness of a photograph. Maren pieced together most of it later, but she understood the shape of it right then, because she had spent 10 years reading rooms through the fog of a diner window. The man with the cap had run the loading crews for 11 years. Money had come down from the company for equipment, for the harnesses and the cable and the inspections, and some of that money had not gone where it was supposed to go, and it had gone on not going there for a long time, and eventually a chain that should have been replaced 2 winters ago had not been replaced, and 2 men who had walked onto a dock that morning expecting to walk off it in the same condition had not. Both of them would recover. Neither of them would load a crate again. What Maren watched through the glass was August Rourke setting a folder on the desk and opening it and turning it around so the man with the cap could see what was in it, photographs and receipts, and then setting a single sheet of paper beside it, a list of names typed one under another. She saw the man's face change when he read the list, and she understood that the list was not a list of the guilty. It was a list of everyone the man loved. Then August said 3 sentences. His mouth barely moved. Whatever those 3 sentences were, the man with the cap stopped turning it and stood very still, and then nodded once, and then again, faster. And then he said something with his whole face working, some appeal or apology or offer, and August Rourke did not answer him at all. He simply closed the folder and looked at him and waited. And the terrible thing, the thing Maren carried out of that corridor and did not shake for a long while afterward, was that when the man finally left the room, he passed within an arm's length of her on the bench, and his face was not the face of a man who had been ruined. It was the face of a man who had been shown a door, and had understood that there had been other doors available, and that this one was a mercy. He was out of the city before the night was over. He left everything. He never came back, and he told anyone who asked him afterward that he had been treated better than he deserved, and he meant it. Then the office door opened, and the same voice that had said those 3 sentences said her name from inside the room, pleasant and unhurried, as though nothing at all had happened in there, and Marin Sloane stood up and went in. He had put his coat back on. He offered her coffee, and she said no. He did not sit behind the desk with her in front of it. He pulled a second chair around and sat where she could see him, which she noticed and filed away. Then he told her the whole of it plainly: the will, the birthday, the council, the 3 conditions, the cousin with the petition already half written. He did not soften any of it. He did not tell her she would be helping anybody. He told her he needed a woman to live under his roof for 31 days and be married inside them, and that in return she could name a number, and that if the number was reasonable he would pay it, and if it was unreasonable he would probably pay that too. And he told her, last, that he had watched her hand him a man's lie in a train station in under a minute, and that he had a house full of people he could no longer be certain of, and that she was the only person he had met in 6 years whose eyes he wanted in the room. Marin looked past his shoulder at the frosted glass, and the one clear panel cut into it. "No," she said. "Thank you for the coat. I'll have it sent back." The sign came down on a Thursday. Not down, exactly. The bottom third of it simply was not there anymore when Marin came around the corner in the last dark before the morning shift. The painted letters that had said dots since before she was born now ending in a jagged nothing, and the sidewalk beneath it swept clean, which was the detail that told her it had not been an accident, because accidents do not sweep up after themselves. Dot Whitaker was already inside with the coffee going, and she did not look up when Marin came in, and she said only that a man had come by the evening before with a folder and a great deal of politeness, and that the building had changed hands, and that the new arrangement did not include a diner. She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, wiping down a counter that was already clean. And then the man came to put the notice on the door, and Marin was standing at the register when he walked in with the tape in his hand, and she knew him instantly. Not his name. She had never known his name. But she knew that he took his coffee black, with 2 sugars stirred in before he sat, that he had come in on Tuesdays and Fridays for a year and a half, that he read the sports page back to front, that he had once left his gloves on the stool, and she had kept them behind the counter for 3 weeks until he came back for them, and that he had thanked her that day and called her sweetheart, and had never once asked what she was called. He did not recognize her now. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fixture, and he said good morning, and he taped the notice to the inside of the glass, and he left. And Marin Sloane stood there with her hand still on the register and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and had nowhere to go, that a man could sit at your counter for a year and a half and still be the man they sent to take it from you, and that he would do it without ever knowing he had been served by anybody at all. She was at the port office before the morning was over. August Rourke did not act surprised to see her and did not gloat, which she gave him credit for later. She told him she was not selling herself, and she was not selling her name, and she was not selling anything that would still be gone after the 31 days were over, and that what she was selling was 31 days of work, and that if he wanted that, she had 3 conditions, and they were not negotiable. First, separate rooms, and no one in that house was ever to be told otherwise, because she was not going to build the whole thing on a lie told to the very people whose word would have to hold it up. Second, the diner. Not saved by charity and not bought as a gift, but back in Dot Whitaker's hands under Dot Whitaker's name, and Marin wanted to see the paper. Third, and she said this one more slowly than the others, when it was over, cleanly, and nobody was to come looking for her afterward with an envelope or a favor or a job, because she had spent her whole life having things handed to her by people who then owned a little piece of her, and she was done with that. August listened to all 3 without interrupting, which almost nobody in her life had ever done, and then he agreed to all 3 in the order she had given them, and then he said one more thing. He said that the second condition was the only one that would cost him anything, and that she should know it was also the only one that had made him certain about her. The gray stone house stood behind a low wall on a street where the trees were older than the buildings, and it did not look like money so much as it looked like a place money had settled into a long time ago and stopped moving. Nobody carried her bag for her, because she did not let them, and that was the first thing the household noticed about her. Bernadette Nash, who had run the house for 22 years and whom everyone in it called Bertie, except the man who paid her, met Marin in the front hall with her hands folded and looked her over once, thoroughly, from the shoes upward, and then said, "This way, girl," and turned and walked. And Marin followed her past 7 doors on the 2nd floor. 7 bedrooms in a house with 1 man living in it, and none of them had the air of being used. Her room was at the end, and it had been made up that morning, and there were fresh asters in a glass on the sill, and Marin stood looking at them for a while and could not decide what they meant. That first night she woke in the deep part of it, thirsty and disoriented in a bed too soft for her, and she came down the stairs in her socks with her hand on the rail. There was a light on in the library. Through the half-open door, she could see the long green sofa near the cold fireplace, and August Rourke asleep on it in his shirt sleeves with a blanket he had clearly pulled over himself without unfolding, one arm hanging down, a book on the floor beside him where it had dropped. 7 bedrooms upstairs. Bertie found her in the kitchen a moment later and did not seem surprised at anything, and only said, "He does that," and did not explain it, and poured her a glass of water, and went back to bed. The dinner had been on the calendar since before any of this began. A thing the family did 4 times a year in that house, whether anybody wanted it or not, and Bertie told Marin about it the way you tell someone about weather that is already on its way. 7 men came. Marin was seated at the foot of the table because that was where August had put her, deliberately and in full view, and she spent the first part of the evening discovering that the hardest work she had done in 10 years was sitting still with her hands in her lap while other people were served. She lasted through the soup. When the plates came off, she was already half standing before she caught herself, and by then her hands had done what her hands had done every night since she was 17, stacking scrape side down, silverware crossed on top, 3 plates up 1 forearm without looking. She realized it at the exact moment the room did. There was a small silence. Then one of the men at the middle of the table laughed, not cruelly, just the reflexive laugh of a man watching something out of place, and set his own napkin down as though to help, and then obviously did not. And Desmond Rourke, who had been pleasant all evening in the way that costs a man nothing, leaned back in his chair and laughed louder than anyone, and let it run a moment longer than the room needed, and then he said, without lowering his voice at all, that they should all take a good look, because this was what the family had come to, and that when the council asked what kind of wife his cousin had found, someone ought to be honest and say she was hired the way you hire anything else, off her feet in a station at the end of a shift, and that the only difference between tonight and any other night of her life was that tonight nobody had left her a tip. The table went very quiet. Somebody coughed. August had not moved and had not changed expression, and Marin understood, standing there with 3 plates on her arm and 7 men looking at her, that whatever happened next was hers to decide, and that a great deal depended on it. She did not put the plates down. She carried them out to the kitchen because they were already in her hands, and because that was what you did with plates. And she came back in and stood behind her chair and said, to Desmond and to the whole table, that she had waited on men for 10 years, and had learned in the first month that the ones who talked about the tip were never the ones who left it. Then she sat down. There was a sound from somewhere near the middle of the table that a man tried to turn into clearing his throat. Desmond smiled and let it go, but the room had shifted a quarter turn away from him and he could feel it, and he did not speak again for a long while. It was later, when the coffee came, that she broke the glass. She reached for a water glass at the same moment as the man beside her, and her knuckle caught the stem, and it went off the edge and struck the floor and did not roll. It simply came apart, a sound like a small bell being told to stop. And Marin went rigid. She knew that glass. She had picked one up that afternoon while helping Bertie set the table. Had felt the weight of it, thin as paper and heavy as a stone, cut in a pattern that caught the light in a way she had never seen a glass do, and she had held it, and known, without being told, that it was worth 2 full shifts on her feet, the tips included. She stood there with her hand still open in the air, and not one person at that table turned around, not one head moved. The conversation went on directly over the top of it. A man was finishing a story about a horse. Someone asked for the cream, and a woman in an apron came in without being called, and swept it up, and was gone again before Marin had lowered her hand. That, more than the 7 bedrooms and the wall and the old trees on the street, was the moment Marin Sloane understood exactly how far she had traveled to sit at that table. In her world, a broken glass stopped everything. Here it did not even earn a look. Afterward, when the cars had gone and the house had emptied down to its own quiet, she found August in the front hall and said, quietly, that he ought to know something about the man who had sat third on his left. She said she had noticed 3 things over the course of the evening. That the man had told the table he had not touched a drink in 2 years, and had ordered plain soda with lime, and had held that glass by putting his thumb up on the rim, which is how a man holds a glass he is used to holding, not how he holds a glass he asked for. That he had never once looked at what he was drinking, and people only stop looking at what they drink when they drink the same thing every day, and that he had arrived in another man's car, but had gone out the side door at the end of the evening and turned left down the drive without hesitating, toward the space behind the greenhouse where the family parked, which meant he had been to that house before, at night, when its owner was not home. He did not ask her whether she was certain. He did not ask her to say it again, or to describe the man's hands, or to explain how a person could build a conclusion like that out of a thumb on a rim and a turn down a driveway. He stood in the front hall with his coat over his arm and listened until she was finished, and then he said thank you and good night, and he went into the library, and that was all. Maren went up the stairs feeling something she could not name and did not enjoy, which was the particular hollowness of having handed over something valuable and received nothing back that told her where it had gone. She expected, over the following days, to notice an absence. She had watched a man walk out of a port office with his cap in his hands, and she assumed she now knew how these things ended. But the man who had sat third on the left came to the house twice that week. He came for coffee in the morning room and stayed an hour. He was given a folder to look at. He was shown, in confidence, with the door closed, a shipping schedule that August described as a problem he was trying to keep quiet, and he made sympathetic noises and left with the shape of it in his head, and he was walked to his car by the man himself, which was a courtesy the household had seen extended perhaps 4 times in as many years. Maren watched all of it from the landing and from the doorway of the morning room and from the kitchen window, and she understood none of it for 2 days, and then she understood all of it at once. The schedule was wrong. Not clumsily wrong, not obviously wrong. It was wrong in one small particular that only mattered to a person planning to be somewhere at a certain time, and whatever came back to August afterward, whoever moved and whoever waited, and whoever showed up at the wrong dock on the wrong evening, would tell him not only that the man third on the left was carrying, but exactly whose ear he was carrying it to, and how fast, and how much of it got there intact. He was not going to lose the man. He was going to keep him, and feed him, and let him walk that food across the city again and again, and the man would go on believing he was trusted, right up until the day it stopped being useful. She found August in the library that evening, standing at the shelf with a glass he was not drinking from. She said she had told him a thing about a man. She had not told him what to do with it, and August Rourke turned around and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something almost apologetic, and not apologetic at all. "A man who lies to you is worth more than a man who does not," he said, "provided you find out first. If I take him out of the room, I have a clean house, and I know nothing. If I leave him in it, I have a rotten board in the floor, and I know exactly where to step, and so does everyone who follows him in." He set the glass down. "My father taught me that before I was old enough to shave," he said, "and he was wrong about a great many things, but he was not wrong about that." Maren stood in the doorway and did not answer for a while. She had spent 5 days in that house telling herself that she had made a business arrangement with a hard man, and she understood now that hard was not the word, and had never been the word. The word was patient. He would wait. He would let a man come to his table and drink his coffee, and take his money, and go on believing himself clever. For weeks, for months, for as long as it stayed profitable, and there would be nothing personal in it at any point, and that was the part that put a cold hand on the back of her neck. "I don't think I like the way you think," she said. He did not argue with her. "You will get used to it," he said. It was Bertie who said it first, at the kitchen table. In the flat way she said everything. That a house this size with a boy staying across town in it was a foolish arrangement, and that if the child was going to sleep somewhere he might as well eat somewhere, and that she had already told the cook. So Milo came to dinner on a Sunday, with his own small suitcase and his book under his arm, and he was 6 years old, and had never in his life been in a room that big, and he handled it the way 6-year-olds handle things, which is to say he looked up once, said, "Huh," and then asked where the bathroom was. He was not shy of August Rourke. Nobody had told him to be, which turned out to be the whole difference. He looked at the man at the head of the table the way he looked at everything else in the house, with frank practical interest, and somewhere between the potatoes and the pie, he asked him whether he liked plants. August said he supposed he did not think about it much. Milo said that was not an answer, and Bertie put her napkin to her mouth and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. And August, who had spent the week teaching a man to carry lies across a city, found himself explaining to a first grader that there was a greenhouse on the roof and that he had not been up in it in a long while. Milo asked to see it. So they went up, the three of them, and the boy walked the length of the beds with his hands behind his back like a small inspector, and stopped at the water can and picked it up and asked how often. August said he did not know. Milo said his aunt watered on Tuesdays and Fridays, and that you were supposed to put your finger in the dirt first, and if it came out clean, you waited. August said that seemed like a lot of trouble. Milo said, with enormous patience, that it was less trouble than a dead plant. And August Rourke laughed out loud, an actual laugh, and Bertie, standing in the doorway, heard a sound she had not heard in that house in 11 years, and turned around and went back down the stairs and did not tell anybody why. They argued about it for 10 minutes. The boy did not give an inch. Then he set the can down and dug in his pocket and pulled out a card, folded once, soft at the edges from being carried, and handed it over and said this was the good cake, and would he make it, because his aunt could make it, but she made it wrong on purpose, less sugar, and he had been waiting for somebody in this house to have a proper kitchen. He said all of it cheerfully, swinging one foot, entirely untroubled. August unfolded the card. It was a recipe, written out in a woman's hand, rounded and careful, the kind of writing a person uses when they intend the thing to be kept. Halfway down, in the margin beside the sugar, someone had written in smaller letters, more than it says. August Rourke stood in his mother's greenhouse, holding a stranger's handwriting, and did not say anything for a moment. And Milo, who was 6, and had already moved on, was crouched at the end of the last bed asking what the purple ones were called. Marin had come up the stairs behind them without either of them noticing, and she was standing in the doorway when the boy asked, and she was looking where he was looking. There were asters at the end of that bed, a low, untidy crowd of them, deep purple, still going strong this late in the year. And on the outer edge of the clump, where the stems came up thickest, there were 7 cuts, clean and low and recent, the way a person cuts when they have been taught how, and have not done it in a long time. Marin Sloane stood there and did the arithmetic without wanting to. 11 years that no one had been allowed to touch that bed. Bertie had told her that on the second day, in passing, the way you mention a rule so obvious it is barely worth stating. And on a wet morning at the end of a station platform, a man she had never met had been standing under a glass roof, holding 7 of them. She did not say anything about it. Milo asked again what they were called. August told him, and the boy said they were his favorite now, which was the sort of thing he decided about 4 times a week, and asked whether he could water them, and was told he could not, and argued about that too. There is a kind of number a person carries the way other people carry a wedding ring, without noticing it most days, and without ever taking it off. Marin Sloane had carried 3 characters for 2 years. She had come around a corner into the last part of a night, and there had been a car pulling away, and she had not been close enough to do anything, and had been close enough to see, and what she had kept was the tail end of a plate and a dent low on the rear passenger door, deep and old, the kind a car gets in a parking lot and its owner decides not to fix. Her sister Junie was gone before the morning. In the 2 years since, Marin had said those 3 characters out loud more times than she could count. She had given them to the officers who came to the apartment, twice, patiently the first time, and less patiently the second. She had given them to a man from the insurance company, who wrote them down and never called back. She had given them to a lawyer who explained, kindly, that a waitress at the end of a double shift describing 3 characters and a dent was not a thing that could be built on, and that memory was the least reliable evidence there was, and that he was sorry. She had stopped saying them out loud after that. She had not stopped saying them. It was Bertie who put her in the office in the first place, on an ordinary afternoon, because the household books were being pulled together ahead of the council, and because the woman who usually did it had gone to her daughters in Ohio, and because, as Bertie put it, the girl had a head on her. So Marin sat on the floor of a back office, in the gray stone house, with the old dispatch ledgers of the family's trucking concern stacked around her, sorting them by year, doing the flattest possible work, and she was not looking for anything, and had no reason on earth to be. The ledgers went back a long way. Each page was a column of dates and destinations, and a column of vehicles, listed by the last 3 characters of the plate, because that was how dispatchers had always written them, quick and short, and beside some of them, a clerk had added a note in the margin about a fault, a bad tire, a heater out, a light gone. And on a page in the middle of a book 2 years old, in a clerk's small, tired handwriting, Maren Sloane's 3 characters looked up at her off the paper. She sat very still. She read the line 4 times. She read the whole page, and then the page before it and the page after it, to be certain she was not doing the thing that grief does to people. The vehicle was listed against a run out of the South Haven yard, and in the margin, in the same tired hand, someone had written that the rear passenger side door was dented and to stop putting in requests about it because it was not going to be repaired. She did not cry. She noticed that about herself later and could not account for it. She closed the ledger and put her hand flat on the cover and sat on the floor of that office, with her back against a filing cabinet, while the light went from one wall to the other, and the whole enormous machinery of the last 2 years turned over slowly in her chest and set itself down in a different position. Every man who had ever explained to her that a waitress could not be trusted to remember a number had been wrong. She had been right the entire time. She had been right in the apartment, and right in the office, and right in the lawyer's chair with her hands in her lap. And it had made no difference at all to anybody, because being right had never been the problem. Being heard was the problem. And she thought about a man at her counter for 1.5 years who had called her sweetheart and never asked her name, and about 7 men at a long table who had not turned around for a broken glass, and she understood that these were not separate facts about her life. They were the same fact. Then she thought about whose ledger it was, and whose yard, and whose name was painted on the side of every truck in that column, and she took her hand off the cover of the book. The diner was still open, because the notice on the glass had a date on it, and the date had not come yet, and Dot Whitaker was behind the counter the way she had been behind that counter for 30 years, wiping down a surface that did not need it. She looked up when the bell went, and she took in the bag on Maren's shoulder, and the wet coat, and the hour, and she did not ask a single question. She turned a cup over on the saucer, and filled it, and put it down in front of the 3rd stool from the door, which was where Maren had sat on the day she came in at 17, and she went back to wiping. Maren sat with both hands around the cup, and did not drink any of it. After a while she said she had made a mistake, and Dot said most people do, and kept wiping. After another while, Maren said she had gone into that house telling herself it was 31 days of work and nothing else, and that she had been lying to herself somewhere around the 4th day and had not noticed until tonight, and Dot stopped wiping then, and put the cloth down and stood with her hands flat on the counter. Her hands shook, the way they had shaken for a few years now, and she pushed them down against the counter to still them, which was a thing Maren had watched her do 1,000 times and had never once remarked on. Then Dot Whitaker said, "I never told you why I hired you." Maren looked up. Dot said she had a daughter, that the girl had been 20 when she left, and that they had said things to each other that week that neither of them had meant in the way the other had heard them, and that on the Friday she had gone, and that was 31 years ago in March. Not taken, not lost. She packed a case and walked out the front and went, and there had been one postcard from Kansas City with 4 words on it and nothing since. Dot did not know where she was. She did not know if she had married, or had children, or had a good life, or had a hard one. She did not know if she was alive. There was no grave to go to and no date to mark and nothing at all to put a hand on. She said that people think the worst thing is knowing, and that she had learned it is not. The worst thing, she said, is that there is no last page. You do not get to close it. It just stays open on the table for 31 years, and you keep walking past it. Maren asked, quietly, why the night shift? Dot said she had tried the day shift twice, and had gone back both times. She said if you are a woman with a daughter somewhere out in the world, you find you do not much like the idea of your door being locked at night. Somebody could come. It would be late, probably, because that is when people finally get up the nerve for things. And if the lights are off, and the sign is turned around, they might just keep walking. So she had kept the lights on for 31 years. And there had been a great many nights when nobody at all came in but truck drivers and 3rd shift nurses, and once a man who cried into his eggs and never told her why, and she had served all of them, and she had never once regretted the electric bill. Then she said, I never asked you anything. When a 17-year-old walks through my door and asks for work, and does not want to say where she came from, I do not ask, because somewhere out there another woman's daughter walked into somebody's diner, and I have spent my whole life hoping to God that whoever was behind that counter had the sense to just pour the coffee. Maren put her forehead down on the counter, on the back of her own hands, and Dot Whitaker reached over and put one shaking hand on the crown of her head and left it there. and neither of them said anything for a long time. He came on the third night, and he came alone. And he came in through the front door of the diner like anybody else, and stood there dripping with a flat cardboard folder held under his coat to keep it dry. Dot looked at him a long moment from behind the counter, and then went into the kitchen without a word, and left the two of them the whole empty room. Maren did not get up. August did not sit down. He said he was not there to ask her for anything and would not, and that he had found what he said he would find, and that she had a right to it whether she ever spoke to him again or not. Then he put the folder on the counter and opened it. He said her sister's name first, which she had not expected, and it went through her like cold water. Junie Sloane had worked nights in a dispatch office at the South Haven yard. Maren knew that. What Maren had never known, because Junie had never said a word about it at home, was that in the last month of her life, Junie had begun keeping a second set of notes in her own hand, on the back of the carbon sheets, because a run had come through her window, with 2 different sets of papers on it. Same truck, same night, 2 manifests, both signed, describing 2 different loads going to 2 different places. She had flagged it once, in writing, in the proper way, to the proper person. The flag was in the folder. 3 weeks later there was the car, and the night, and everything that came after. And then August turned the folder around and showed her the second thing. And his voice did something on the way to it that she had not heard from him before. 4 years earlier, a boy named Casey Rourke had been 19 and had been working the port side of the same operation because his father believed a Rourke should know what a crate weighed before he was allowed to sign for one. Casey had found the same discrepancy from the other end, the same numbers refusing to agree. He had gone to his brother about it, and his brother had told him it was a clerical mess and to leave it alone, and Casey had not left it alone. And 3 weeks after that, there had been a night that August Rourke had never once described out loud to another human being in 6 years. Maren said, quietly, that they had never met. August said no. He said they had never been in a room together, never known the other existed, and had died 4 years apart over the same sheet of paper and the same hand holding it. And then he stood there in that empty diner with the rain running off him and said the other thing, the thing he had come to say and had been dreading the whole way across the river. He said that 6 years ago he had gone looking, that he had been 28 and out of his mind and had turned the city over, that a man he trusted had come to him within the week with a direction, a name, a set of reasons that hung together, a group working out of the north side with a motive that made sense if you did not look at it too long. And August Rourke had done what a man with his name was expected to do, thoroughly, and he had done it believing every word he had been told. He had closed it. He had gone to his father afterward and told him it was closed, and the old man had put a hand on the back of his neck and said nothing, and August had carried the belief that his brother was settled for 6 years, the way you carry a stone in your coat, heavy and cold and yours. And tonight he had gone back and read the direction he had been given 6 years ago, with the ledgers open beside it. And the man who had come to him within the week with a name and a reason and a set of hangings together had been Desmond. He did not raise his voice. He put both hands flat on the counter. He said, "I spent 6 years thinking I had buried my brother's business. It turns out I was the shovel." Maren looked at him. He was not angry. That was what undid her. She had braced herself for fury, because fury she could have stood in the doorway of. But the man in front of her was hollowed out and perfectly still. A man who has just discovered that the one thing he did in his life he was proud of, the one violent certainty he had allowed himself, had been aimed for him by the person it was meant to protect. He had been used as a tool against his own dead, and the same hand that had aimed him had, 4 years later, put a truck on a street at the end of a night shift. She said his brother's name out loud, once, for the first time. Casey. He said yes. She asked how old. He said 19. She said her sister had been 32. And then Maren Sloane sat on a stool in a diner that was going to be closed by the end of the month and understood that she had spent 2 years being the only person in the world who cared what had happened to Junie, and that she was not the only person anymore, and that the second person had walked into her reign the same way she had once walked into someone else's, and she did not know yet whether that was mercy or the cruelest thing that had ever happened to her. She went back to the gray stone house the next evening, and she did not make a speech about it, and neither did anybody else. Bertie took her bag out of her hand at the door and carried it up herself, and that was the entire conversation on the subject. And because Maren Sloane had not stopped being who she was, she noticed the boy on her second day back. Reese Dolan was 20 and drove the second car and was the youngest person in the household by 15 years, and he had been perfectly ordinary until the evening she came down the back stairs and saw him standing at the end of the drive with a telephone he had not been issued, angled away from the house, talking fast and low, and she watched him look at the kitchen window twice while he did it. She did not tell anyone. She waited 2 days, and then she came out the side door while he was polishing a fender, and she said, without any heat in it at all, that she knew, and she watched the color go out of his face in stages. He did not deny it. He told her about his mother and the hospital on Fullerton, and the bills that had come in a stack and gone on coming, and about a man who had been very kind and very patient, and had never once asked him for anything that felt like a betrayal, until it was far too late to stop. He was crying by the end, badly, the way a 20-year-old cries when he has been holding something for months. Marin took him by the elbow and walked him out the back gate into the alley, and she took every dollar she had left in the world out of her coat, which was not a great deal and was all of it, and she put it in his hand and closed his fingers over it. She told him to go tonight, to go to his mother, and not to come back. And then she told him the important part, which was that he was never to tell a living soul that she had been the one who saw him. He asked her why she was doing it. She said that a person's whole life can turn on whether somebody decides to look at them or look through them, and that she had been looked through more times than she could count, and that she was not going to be the one who did it to him. Then she went back inside and washed the dishes she had left in the sink. Nobody in that house ever knew. It was that same night that Grady Sutter came, and he had driven straight through from Georgia without stopping, unshaven and gray with it, and he stood in the front hall with his hat in his hand because Bertie would not let him pass the mat with those boots. He had brought the lease. He had brought the letters. He put them on the hall table and told Marin that the storefront in Savannah with the low rent and the good back lot had been arranged by a broker who had never once met the owner, and that when Grady had finally pushed hard enough to see who was behind the money, the name that came out from underneath it was Rourke, and not the Rourke standing 10 feet away. He said he had torn up his half of it in the man's office and had gotten in the truck and driven. He said he was not asking her for anything, and had never been asking her for anything, and that he had only ever wanted her out of a city that had taken enough from her, and that he was ashamed to have been the vehicle. He looked at August and said, plainly, that he did not like him and did not intend to, and that he would still shake his hand if it meant the man who did this got what was coming. It was Grady's letters that opened the last door, because the broker's correspondence went back further than Savannah, and in among it, dated in the week before all of this began, there was an itinerary and a hotel in New York, and a name that stopped both of them where they stood. Genevieve Ashford had not looked out a train window and lost her nerve. 3 days before she boarded, somebody had come to see her. He had been courteous. He had shown her documents, photographs, a newspaper file, an account of what had happened to a 19-year-old boy 6 years ago, enough of it true to carry the rest, and he had let her draw her own conclusions. And he had left her alone with them for 3 days on a train. She had stepped down onto that platform already broken, and had not been able to make her feet carry her another yard. And Marin Sloane stood in that hallway and felt the whole beginning of the thing turn over and show its other side, the rain on the glass roof and the flowers and the woman shaking too hard to hold a cup, and understood that none of it had been chance. It had all been arranged, down to the last detail, by a man who had planned for everything except one thing. He had never once considered that the woman wiping down the counter might sit down. They came in the deepest part of the night, when the street outside was empty in both directions, and the only other light on the block was the pharmacy sign, which had been broken for 2 years and buzzed. Marin was there because she had gone back to work her old shift, the paper on the door notwithstanding, on the theory that a diner with somebody in it is harder to take than a diner without. There were 5 of them. Fitz-Barlow did not come himself. Men like that never do. They came in through the front and stood in the aisle between the counter and the booths, and said a great deal of nothing in a very reasonable tone about a building and a date and a set of keys. And Dot Whitaker came out from behind the counter with her chin up and put herself directly in the doorway of her own kitchen, 70 years old, both hands shaking, and told them they could take it up with her in the morning like men. Marin got her by the shoulders and moved her, and Dot fought her for a second, and then did not. And Marin put her through the kitchen door and turned the lock on the back with the key from her apron and put the key down the front of her shirt. Then she came back out and did the thing nobody expected, which was that she went along the wall and turned on every light in the place. The overheads, the case lights, the sign, the lamp over the register that had been dead since summer and came on anyway. The room went white. And then she walked to the front and pushed the door all the way open so that the street could see in and the room could see out. And she started saying names. She said, "Ray, you come in Tuesdays. You take it black, and you leave $2 every single time whether you eat or not, and you have been doing it since your wife passed." And a heavy man near the back of the group stopped moving. She said, "Marty Kessel, your girl had the counter job here the summer she turned 16, and I trained her myself, and you came in on the last day and thanked me." She said, "Bill, your knee. You sit in the second booth because you cannot fold up into the first one, and I have been bringing you the extra napkins for 4 years without you ever having to ask." She went down the line. She did not shout. She used the voice she had used on 1,000 men at 3 a.m, who did not want to be told anything by anybody. Level and unhurried and impossible to argue with, and she called every one of them by their name and told them one true thing about themselves that only a person who had been standing behind that counter looking at them could know. Ray went first. He said something under his breath that might have been an apology, and he turned and walked out and did not stop. Marty Kessel stood there for a long moment with his jaw working, and then he went after him. The two behind them looked at each other, and the arithmetic changed in the room, and they went. The last one did not. He was younger, and he had not been in the diner before, and she had no name for him, and that was the whole difference. And he came forward and got his hand on the edge of the register. Then the doorway darkened. August Rourke came in out of the rain and did not say a word. He took hold of the man's wrist and moved him off the counter and turned him around and walked him the length of the aisle and out the door. And it was over in about 4 seconds, and it was not a fight. It was a thing being carried out of a room and set down on a sidewalk. And the man went into the wet street and picked himself up and looked back once at the lit windows and thought better of everything and went. Behind him, the bell over the door swung and settled. Dot came out of the kitchen and sat down heavily in the second booth. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Marin picked up the cloth and began wiping the counter, because there was nothing else in the world for her hands to do, and August saw that both of them were shaking so badly the cloth was making a sound against the formica. She wiped it anyway. She went end to end, twice, and the shaking would not stop. And somewhere in the second pass she began to sing, very quietly, barely above breath, without any awareness at all that she was doing it. It was an old song, slow and in a minor key, about a boat that never comes back to harbor, and she sang it the way her mother had sung it to her, and the way she had sung it to herself in every frightened hour of her life since she was small, because it was the only thing she had ever found that would put her hands back where they belonged. August Rourke stood in the middle of that floor and did not move. The color went out of his face. He knew that song. He had never heard it in a room in his life. He had heard it once, in the cold, in the dark, under a bridge on the west side, from a voice he could not see and never found, going on and on beside his ear while the snow came down on both of them, and he had spent 3 years trying to remember the tune and had never once been able to hold it. He heard it now. He said her name. She looked up, still wiping, and asked him what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. He said it too quickly, and she let it go because she was tired past arguing, and he drove her home through streets with no other cars on them, and neither of them said anything the whole way. But that night, in a house where everybody else was asleep, August Rourke sat in the library with the lamp off and let himself go back to the thing he had spent 3 years refusing to look at directly. There had been a winter night when the snow came down so heavily the city gave up on it. The plows outmatched, the streetlights out in whole blocks on the west side because a transformer had gone somewhere near the river. His car had gone off the ramp under the overpass at South Haven, and it had not been dramatic. It had simply been a slow, bad slide, and then a stop. And afterward he had been on the ground beside it in the dark, unable to get up and unable to make his hands do anything, and the snow had come down on his shoulders and started to stay there. Cars went by up on the ramp. He counted them for a while and then stopped counting. Nobody came down, and then somebody did. He never saw her face. The light was gone and his eyes would not hold anything, and afterward he could not have told anyone whether she was tall or short. What he remembered was that she came down the embankment without hesitating, and that she got him turned so the wind was off him, and that she took something from around her own neck and wound it twice around his, a gray scarf, hand-knitted, thick, still warm from a person, and that she talked to him for a while and then stopped talking and sang instead, because talking had not been keeping him with her, and singing did. She sang that same slow old thing about a boat that does not come back, over and over, right beside his ear, for as long as it took. He remembered asking her something at one point, some fragment, and getting no answer he could hold on to. He remembered the sound of a siren coming up the ramp and turning, and the feeling of the snow being brushed off his face by a hand, and then the space beside him being empty. She was gone before the ambulance reached him. She had never given her name, and had never asked for his, and he had woken up in a hospital bed the next morning alone with a gray wool scarf on the chair beside him, and he had spent the better part of a year quietly looking for her, and had found nothing at all, because there was nothing to find, because the entire event had lasted less than an hour, and had left no record anywhere except in him. He had folded the scarf and put it in the second drawer of that desk, and it had been there for 3 years, and he had never once shown it to anybody or explained it, and now he took it out and held it, and did not trust himself to think clearly about any of it. He put it back. He went up the stairs, and at the end of the hall on the 3rd floor he stopped in front of a door that had not been opened in 6 years, and he took the key off the ring, and he opened it. The room was cold and it was clean because Bertie had gone on cleaning it without ever being told to, and without ever being thanked. The bed was made. There were textbooks in a stack on the desk with a receipt still marking a page. There was a pair of basketball shoes under the edge of the dresser with one of them on its side, the way a boy leaves them when he is 19 and comes in late and is going to put them away tomorrow. Marin found him standing in the middle of it a while later, because she had heard the door and had come up. She stopped on the threshold. He did not turn around. He said that he had told his father, once, that Casey did not belong anywhere near the port and should be sent somewhere else and made to study something useless, and that his father had said O'Rourke does not get to hide from what pays for him. He said that he had let it go, because it had been easier to let it go, and because he had been 28 and busy. He said, he was 19. He died over what my family does for money. He said that everybody in the city assumed he wanted the waterfront because it was worth something, and because his name was on it, and that they were all wrong. He said he did not want to hold that port to be a richer man. He wanted to hold it so that there would not be a second boy. He did not say a single word about a scarf, or a bridge, or a song. He had known since the moment she opened her mouth over that counter. He put it away, the way he had put away everything else in his life, and stood in his brother's room with his back to her, and said nothing at all. The manifests had a yard number on them, and the yard number belonged to a block of storage at the far west end of the port that had gone out of regular use years ago, and they went out there together on the 26th night, with a flashlight and a set of keys that no longer opened everything they used to. The place was a maze of steel, containers stacked 4 high in long parallel rows with lanes between them barely wide enough for a truck, and one working crane light up on its arm that swung slowly across the whole yard and back again on a timer, so that every lane went from black to white to black in a rhythm you could count on. They found the unit. They got it open. And what was inside was not cargo at all, but paper, boxes of it. The original file copies that should have been destroyed 4 years ago, and 6 years ago, and had not been, because the man who ordered them destroyed had kept them instead, the way a certain kind of man always keeps the thing that could hang him because he cannot quite believe it will ever be used against him. August had one box open, and was on his knee in front of it, when they heard the gate. It was a long way off, and it was unmistakable, the heavy grind of a rolling gate motor starting up, and then, a moment later, the sound changing pitch as it began to come down. He said run, and neither of them did anything else for the next several minutes. They went down the lane between the stacks with the flashlight off, because the crane light was better than a flashlight and worse, and every time it came around, they had to be behind steel. They heard men at the north end, 2 of them, calling to each other without urgency, which was the frightening part. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was running. They were simply walking the lanes the way you walk a field you have already fenced. August pulled her sideways into a gap between 2 containers, where the corrugation left a person about the width of a coat, and they stood pressed in there, while a set of footsteps came down the lane and passed within arm's reach on the metal grating, and went on, and the crane light came around and turned the whole lane white, and then let it go. The gate motor was still running somewhere behind them, still coming down, and August put his mouth close to her ear and said there was a service door at the southeast corner, and it would be shut, but it would not be locked because the padlock had been broken since spring, and that she should go first. She went. She got 2 lanes over and put her back against cold steel, and waited for the light to swing, and when it came around, she was looking straight at a man standing not 15 feet away, at the mouth of the lane, alone. breathing hard, with his hand on the corner of a container to steady himself. He was in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, a gray zip jacket, a flat cap pushed back, a face gone slack, with the effort of walking a yard he was too old to be walking. And the crane light held him for a full second, and Maren Sloan looked at him, and knew him. Not from a plate, not from a file. She knew him from the third stool from the door. Black coffee, 1 sugar, never 2. Always the same booth if the stool was taken. He came in before the early shift at the yard, 3 or 4 mornings a week, for 2 years. He read the racing page. He had a laugh like a cough. He always, every single time, counted out the exact change and left it in a small stack beside the cup. And he always said, "Thank you, sweetheart." And he had never once in 2 years asked her what her name was. He had sat at her counter, 2 feet away from her, 3 mornings a week, for 2 years, and he had never known that the woman pouring his coffee was the sister of the woman he had left on a street at the end of a night shift, because he had never looked at her face. She stepped out into the lane. She did it in the dark part of the cycle, and he did not hear her until she was already there, and when the light came around again she was standing in front of him with nothing in her hands. He recoiled. He looked at the empty lane behind her, and at the space over her shoulder, and at every part of the yard except her, the way a man does when he is looking for the person he thinks matters. And Maren said, quietly, "Look at me." He did not. She said it again. She said, "You have had my coffee 3 mornings a week for 2 years, and you never once asked me my name, and that is the only reason you have been able to sleep. Look at me." And he looked. She watched it arrive in him. She watched the counter and the racing page, and the exact change come back up through a face that had gone the color of the concrete. And she watched a man who had spent 2 years perfectly comfortable discover that he had been sitting down every week in the presence of the person he owed, and had never seen her, because she had been wearing an apron. He said her sister's name without meaning to. That was how she knew for certain. He started to say something else, something that had the shape of an excuse in it. Orders, a bad night, a man who told him to. She stopped him. She did not raise her voice at all. She said, "You are going to stand in front of the council, and you are going to say every word of that again, and you are going to look at them the way you are looking at me now." Somewhere behind them the gate finished coming down, and the man in the gray jacket, who had run twice in his life and was not going to run a 3rd time, put both hands on his knees in the middle of that lane and stayed exactly where he was. August got out through the service door at the southeast corner because that was the plan, and because she had gone first and he had assumed she was already through it, and it was only when he came around the last stack and found the door standing open on an empty lot and no one in it that he understood she had not gone through at all, that she had turned back somewhere in the dark, and that the yard behind him was now sealed with her inside it. He was reaching for the phone in his coat when it rang in his hand. It was Emmett Vance, and Vance was talking fast, which Vance never did. Solomon Pike had left the county seat that evening with the 2nd envelope, the one nobody but Pike had ever laid eyes on, the one thing the council would accept without argument on the morning of the hearing. His car had been stopped on the North Approach Road by 2 vehicles that had come out of a side lane and boxed it, and Pike's driver had backed up onto the shoulder and was sitting there with the doors locked, and there were men standing in the road in front of him, not doing anything at all, which meant they were waiting for something or someone. Vance said the road was 14 minutes away going hard. He said that if the envelope did not reach the council in the morning, there would be no confirmation, no inheritance, and nothing left to argue over. And that the whole of it, the port, the hotels, the trust, everything Ambrose Rourke had spent his life stacking up, went to Desmond by default at first light. He said, "Go now." August stood on the wet gravel outside a locked gate, with the phone against his ear, and looked back over his shoulder at the yard. 4 rows of steel, 1 crane light going around, 2 men in there walking the lanes without hurrying, and a 3rd somewhere by the north end, and a woman with no weight to her and nothing in her hands, on the wrong side of a gate she could not lift. He asked Vance how long the road would hold. Vance said he did not know. August said, "Then send somebody." Vance said there was nobody to send who would arrive in time and that August knew it. And then, after a pause, in a different voice, the voice of a man who had known him since he was a boy, he said, "Son, do not do this. It is everything." August Rourke said, "I know what it is." He put the phone in his pocket. He got into the car and started it and put it in reverse and came back down the length of the fence line with the gravel going up behind him and at the junction where the north approach road ran left and the yard road ran right, he did not slow down for the turn, and he did not look at the left-hand road at all, and the car came around hard to the right, with the tires letting go for half a second on the wet, and he drove straight at the gate of a container yard on the west end of the port, and left an inheritance sitting on a highway in the dark behind him. He hit the fence at the corner where the chain link met the post, because that was the weak point of every fence in that port, and he had known it since he was 15 years old. He went through it. He came up the main lane, with the headlights on full, and the horn going, all the way down, and every man in that yard turned around, because it was the last thing on earth any of them expected, and the crane light came across and washed out the whole of it. He put the car sideways across the mouth of the third lane and got out of it, and he was not quiet anymore, and he was not patient anymore, and the two men who had been walking those lanes without hurrying saw who had come through the fence and did the arithmetic, and it did not take either of them long. One of them went for the north end, the other one stood his ground for about as long as it takes to change your mind. Then they were both gone over the fence at the back, and the yard was nothing but the sound of the crane motor, and the horn still going because he had left the door open and his knee against it. He found her in the fourth lane, with the man in the gray jacket still sitting on the ground where she had put him, and she was standing over him, and she had not moved, and her hands were completely steady. She looked at August, and at the car sideways in the lane behind him, with the lights on and the fence down across the entrance, and at his face. She said, "The road." He said, "I know." She said, "Pike." He said, "I know." She said, "That was everything you have." And August Rourke stood in the middle of a container yard at the west end of the port with his father's whole life going off a highway somewhere behind him in the dark. And he said, "Yes," he said, "I have made every calculation in this city for 6 years, and I have never once been wrong about what a thing was worth. And I made that one in about a second and a half, and I would make it again." Then he bent down and got the man in the gray jacket up onto his feet by the elbow, almost gently, and said, "You are coming with us," and walked him to the car. The council met in the long room above the old Union Hall on Halsted Street, 5 men at a table and everyone else in chairs against the wall, and it began the way these things always began, with Desmond Rourke standing up and being reasonable. He was very good. That was the thing nobody had prepared Marin for. He did not sneer, and he did not embellish, and he did not say one single word that was untrue. He laid it all out in order. A bride arranged and paid for, and vetted, who had come as far as the platform and turned around. A stranger produced out of a train station the same morning. A woman who had been serving coffee an hour earlier and had no connection to the family, no standing, no history. A household staff who had known her for less than a month. A wedding not yet performed with 5 days left on the clock. He said he took no pleasure in it. He said his cousin was a man he had grown up beside, and that grief did strange things to a man's judgment. He said the council had written its conditions precisely to prevent an arrangement of this shape, and that he was asking them only to look at what was in front of them and call it what it was. And the terrible part, the part that sat in the room afterward like weather, was that every fact he had put on that table was correct. Solomon Pike, who had been stopped on a road the night before, and who had spent 4 hours on the shoulder of it before anyone came, sat with his hands folded and said nothing. August had nothing to hand him. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Rhys Dolan came in with Rain still on his shoulders and an envelope held against his chest with both arms. 20 years old, white as paper, and he stopped just inside the door, because he had never in his life been in a room like that one. He had been the one sent. That was what came out over the next several minutes, in a voice that broke twice and that he kept going anyway. He had been the one who knew the North Approach Road because he had driven it every week for a year, and he had been given a job and a time and told where to be, and he had gone. He had gotten there ahead of the others. He had gone to the car and taken the envelope off the seat, exactly as instructed, and then he had stood in the dark on the shoulder of that road holding it, and he had not driven it back to the man who sent him. He had driven it here and sat outside in his mother's car until morning, because he had not known what else to do with himself. Somebody asked him why. Rhys Dolan looked at the floor and said that a person in that house had caught him at something a few weeks back and could have finished him with a sentence, and had not, and had put the last money she had into his hand instead, and had made him promise never to say she had done it. He said, "So I never did say. But she never told me I couldn't pay it back." Nobody in that room had known. Not August, not Bertie, not Vance, not one of the 5 men at the table. Marin sat absolutely still with her hands in her lap and did not look at anybody. Then the man in the gray jacket stood up, and he said it all again. Every word. The 2 manifests, and the flag Junie Sloane had filed, and the man who had come to him afterward, and what he had been told to do about it, and a night 4 years before that, involving a 19-year-old boy. And the name at the end of every one of those sentences was the same name, and he said it while looking at the floor, because he could not do it any other way. When he finished, Solomon Pike took off his glasses and looked down the table at Desmond Rourke and asked him one question. He asked him whether he knew the name of the woman sitting at the end of the second row. Desmond opened his mouth. He looked at her. Everyone in that room watched him look at her, and watched him try, and watched him fail, and the silence went on 4 full seconds too long. Pike put his glasses back on. He said that in this room, they had spent a great deal of the morning discussing what a marriage was, and whether this one was real, and that he found he was no longer interested in that question. He said the question he was interested in was how a man could stand up and describe a woman's entire life and character to a council of 5 for 20 minutes and not be able to produce her name. And that was the end of it. It took another hour to say formally what everyone had already understood, and Desmond Rourke did not speak again. Afterward, in the corridor outside, with people moving past them in both directions, Marin stood against the wall, and August stood in front of her, and she said, "When did you know?" He said, "The night you sang." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That was 14 days ago." He said yes. She asked him why in God's name he had said nothing, and August Rourke said that if she had known who she was to him, every word she said in that room today would have come out of her mouth already shaped, and Pike would have heard the shape of it, because Pike hears everything. He said, "I have spent my whole life deciding when I speak. It is the only thing I have ever really owned." He said, "That was the first time I ever kept quiet for somebody else, instead of for myself." They were alone in the small room off the hall afterward, the 2 of them, with the door shut and the noise of the building going on somewhere below. August put a folder down on the table between them and did not open it, and Desmond looked at it and knew exactly what it was, because he had spent his life around men who put folders on tables. Everything the man in the gray jacket had said, written down and signed. The file copies out of the container. 2 dates, 2 names, and the paper that connected them to one hand. It was enough to end him in this city, in the fast way, the way that did not involve any counsel or any hearing at all, the way that had been available to men named Rourke for 3 generations, and that everyone in that building understood without ever having to discuss it. Desmond understood it too. He sat down slowly. He said, "Then get on with it." August did not sit. He said that he had thought about it the entire drive over, and that he had gotten as far as the shape of it, and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want it. Not because of mercy. He wanted that understood. He said, "My father would have done it before the sun went down, and he would have slept well, and he would have expected me to do the same, and I have spent my entire adult life trying not to be my father. Make no mistake about what I am. I am still his son, but you are not worth what it would cost me." He picked up the folder and put it under his arm. He said the council would take it instead, all of it, and that Desmond would sit in that long room on Halsted Street and listen while every name was read out in front of the 5 men whose regard he had been chasing since he was a boy, and then in front of every family in the city, and that he would not be sent anywhere, and would not be hidden, and would not be made into anything anyone could feel sorry for. He said, "You are going to live. You are going to live a long time, right here, in this city, in a rented room somewhere on the north side, and you are going to walk into every restaurant in it for the next 30 years and watch the room change temperature, and not one single person in this town is ever going to call you Mr. Rourke again." Then he left him in there. Solomon Pike came to the Greystone house that evening himself rather than sending it, and he sat in the library and took the second envelope out of his coat and said that Ambrose had given it to him 9 years ago, with instructions that it was to be opened only if his son ever let the whole thing go of his own free will, and that Pike had carried it that long, assuming he would die with it still sealed. Vance read it out loud, because August asked him to. It was in Ambrose Rourke's hand, and it was not long, and there was no affection anywhere in it. He wrote that he had known what Desmond was for a long while, since before the boy was grown. He wrote that after Casey he had suspected, and had gone as far as making certain, and had then done nothing at all, because a family that eats itself in public is finished, and because he had judged that the name would not survive it. He wrote that he had let his son go out and put the thing to rest against the wrong door, and had watched him come home believing it was settled, and had said nothing then either. He wrote, "I chose the family over both of them, and I would like to tell you I have not slept since, but I have slept fine, and that is the part you should be most afraid of." And then, near the bottom, he wrote that he had put the marriage condition in the will not because he wanted his son to have a wife. He wrote that he had wanted his son to have somebody in the room, somebody standing close enough to see him make the choice, so that when the moment came, and it always comes, he would not be able to make it the way I made mine. The deed enclosed with the letter transferred the South Haven port. Only that, not the hotels, not the trucking concern, not the trust, none of which had ever been Ambrose's to give conditionally, and all of which passed by default at first light on the 29th day to the man who had defaulted them. And the transfer of the port was itself conditional, in one line, in the old man's own writing. It took effect only if his son signed away his claim to everything else voluntarily and in front of witnesses. Vance took his glasses off and said, quietly, that he had 1 hour to think about it, and that as his attorney, he was obliged to tell him what he was giving up, and that the number was very large. August Rourke asked for the pen. He signed it in front of Pike and Vance and Bertie Nash, who had been asked to stay, and who stood at the end of the table with her hands folded. And when it was done, he put the cap back on the pen and set it down, and looked out the window toward the river, and said, "Well, that is the last of it." Then he asked Bertie whether there was any coffee, and she said there was, and went to get it, and got as far as the hallway before she had to stop and put a hand against the wall. In April, the sign went up at the head of the South Haven docks, plain white letters on green steel, and it read Casey and Junie Cooperative, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the words, "Owned by the families who work here," and there were 411 names on the certificate of membership filed downtown, and not one of them was Rourke. It had taken 5 months of meetings in a union hall to get there, and August had sat through every one of them at the back, in a folding chair like everybody else, and had been shouted at twice by a woman from the third dock, who did not care in the slightest who his father had been, and afterward he had told Marin it was the best evening he had spent in years. The diner reopened in March, under a new sign with the old name on it, painted by hand because Dot Whitaker said she was not going to have anything up there that lit up, and she still worked the night shift, and the door was still unlocked at every hour a person might need it to be. Reese Dolan drove a delivery route now, and came in on Thursdays, and always sat at the third stool from the door, and always got asked how his mother was doing, and always answered properly, because in that place, somebody asks, and somebody answers. On a warm Saturday in the rooftop greenhouse, a boy who had turned 7 in February was on his knees in the dirt at the end of the last bed with a trowel, putting in a whole new row of asters he had picked out himself, and he was explaining, at length and with considerable patience, why a man who waters on a schedule, instead of checking the soil with his finger, should not be allowed to own plants at all. August Rourke, on his knees in the same dirt with his sleeves rolled, argued back that the schedule had worked fine so far, and the boy said that was luck and not skill. And Marin, coming up the stairs with a tray, heard the pair of them going at it before she reached the top, and stood in the doorway a while just to listen. On the hook beside the greenhouse door, where the light came through in the afternoons, hung a gray wool scarf, hand-knitted, thick, a little worn at one end. Nobody had ever suggested putting it away. Nobody ever did. And perhaps that is the whole of it. There are hundreds of people in that neighborhood right now in uniforms and aprons and work jackets, pouring the coffee, carrying the boxes, holding the doors, and most of them will go their entire lives without one person in a position of power ever asking them their name. This story does not tell you that a waitress can stand level with a powerful man, because that is a nice thing to say and it is not always true. It tells you something smaller and much truer. What decides the worth of a person is not the place they happen to be standing. It is what they do on the night when they are certain that nobody will ever know they did it. She gave a young man her last dollars and made him swear to keep it quiet, and that quiet kindness came back 6 months later and stood in a doorway with an envelope. Kindness done in the dark does not disappear. It waits. So look at the people who serve you today. Ask them their name. It costs you nothing, and to them it may be the whole difference. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and subscribe to our channel so you can be with us for every new story we tell. We would truly love to know how this one landed with you, so leave a comment and tell us what you felt, honestly and from the heart, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. We wish you good health, peace in your home, and gentle days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.